The return flight to Sofia went without incident, and then I returned and reported as usual to Hitler, telling him at the same time about the king's delight with what he had achieved. Though he said he would sooner have had Salonika than Burgos, I added. Hitler smiled at that. I dare say he would, Bauer, but we've earmarked Salonika for ourselves. When the war is over, we shall need a port on the Mediterranean. Trieste, the former Mediterranean port of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is in Italian hands, and the Italians are our friends, so I don't want any dispute with Mussolini. The regent of Hungary, Admiral Horthy, was another one who was in at the share-out, and Hitler promised him the Banat frontier province, Carpathian Ukraine, and a part of Galicia. I flew him from Budapest to Wiener Neustadt and back, and after the flight he decorated me with a Hungarian order, the Comptoir Cross, to be worn on a ribbon round the neck. Incidentally, King Boris also presented me with an order, to be worn on a ribbon round the neck. I wore those orders only when I happened to be flying the gentleman who had given them to me. The generous handout of territories naturally didn't please everyone, for example, the people who lived in them. And once at table in the Reich Chancellery, I heard Hitler saying that he had received a deputation of Carpathian Ukrainians. They had, it appeared, begged him not to let their country be swallowed up by Hungary, declaring that they had nothing whatever in common with the Hungarians, historically, culturally or otherwise. In fact, they regarded the measure as nothing short of a national disaster, and they begged him to incorporate their country in the German Reich instead. In his heart, Hitler agreed with them, and he was well aware that the measure would do a great deal of harm to Germany's prestige in Ukraine, but he told us that he had been compelled to send the deputation away disappointed. He had told them that at the end of the war, Congress Poland would become an independent state again with her own government. Germany would want only the Warthegau and the territory of the former Polish corridor through East Prussia. Therefore, to incorporate Carpathian Ukraine into the German Reich would mean to create a new corridor, and in the event of hostilities in the east, the Carpathian Ukraine would be lost at once. Hitler told us that the deputation had left him with tears in their eyes, but that although he had every sympathy with their point of view, he had been unable to take back his word to Horthy. The thing that struck me afterwards was that if at the time Hitler had harboured any intention of attacking Soviet Russia, his decision with regard to Carpathian Ukraine would have been different. The everyday routine of the Reich Chancellery was agreeably broken by a report from Hitler's naval attaché, Captain von Puttkammer, that a U-boat had succeeded in penetrating the defences of Scapa Flow, had sunk 2 armoured cruisers there, and made good its escape. Further reports confirmed the first good news, and then it was announced that the submarine in question, which was under Lieutenant Commander Prien, was returning to its base at Wilhelmshaven. I proposed to Hitler that I should take a couple of Condors to Wilhelmshaven, load the commander and his crew on board, and fly them straight back to Berlin, where Hitler could thank them in person. Hitler agreed, and I landed on the airfield at Wilhelmshaven shortly before the submarine moored. We waited on the airfield, and the whole crew were brought to us at once, exactly as they disembarked from their submarine, without even being given time to change their uniforms and make themselves spick and span. But before we could take off, the naval authorities intervened and insisted that they could not be flown to Hitler without shaving and freshening themselves up. We spent a night in Kiel before flying on the next day, and in the meantime, an official reception had been arranged for our arrival at Tempelhof. By this time, Prien and the others were all well-shaven and in their best uniforms. Representatives of the government and of the municipality were on the airfield to welcome them, and then they were driven straight to the Reich Chancellery, where each man was heartily greeted by Hitler in person. They remained in Berlin for a week, during which they were feted everywhere and loaded with honours. In November 1940, Hitler informed me that I was to fly once again to Moscow, this time to fetch the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov to Berlin for an official visit. All the necessary preparations were made, but then came a telegram from Moscow that our offer was refused. With thanks. Molotov proposed to come with a party of no less than 265 persons, and therefore it would be better to come by train. I happened to be in the entrance hall when Molotov arrived in the Reich Chancellery to see Hitler. He was accompanied by 3 men who were obviously GPU men. Our own people tried to fraternize with them, offering them coffee, cakes, and so on, but the 3 Russians just gave the same stereotyped smile all the time and refused everything, much to the surprise of everyone except those of us who had been in Moscow. Molotov stayed in Berlin for 3 days, from 12 to 14 November inclusive, and it so happened that the British were bombing Berlin at the time, so he had a good opportunity of discovering something about modern warfare at first hand. Incidentally, Hitler totally underestimated him, declaring that he was a cipher, a typical subordinate bureaucrat. In Norway, at about this time, the number of mysterious explosions in planes whilst in the air, resulting in the loss of the machines and their crews, increased to such an extent that there could be no reasonable doubt that the Luftwaffe was faced with very clever sabotage. The British were, of course, suspected at once, and the most searching investigations were conducted. In the end, the cause of the trouble was found. It was a very ingenious time bomb enclosed in a rubber tube. It looked quite harmless, and it was easy to toss it through any one of the many openings to be found on a plane, and there it would lie harmlessly until the plane reached a certain height, when it would explode. Most of the planes destroyed in this way had their tails blown off, after which they plunged down to certain destruction. One of these altitude bombs was handed to me for instructional purposes, so that I and my men could know what to be on the lookout for, because, naturally, if there were any one plane more than another that the British would like to fit with one of these little rubber-covered devices, it was mine. The explosive charge was set off by a special altitude device powered by an ordinary small pocket lamp battery, and as such batteries could be stored for at least a year, the rubber-covered device could lie around for a long time quite harmlessly. But if ever that plane reached the previously arranged height, after that, we naturally greatly increased our precautions. One day, Hitler told me that he would be making a long journey, by rail. It was to meet General Franco on the Franco-Spanish frontier. This meeting took place on 23 October 1940, at Hendaye, and Hitler demanded that Franco should allow his troops to march through Spain to attack Gibraltar. I was given instructions to follow with 3 condors and to do the journey by stages. My first stop was Bordeaux, where we stayed for 2 days waiting for the arrival of the Foreign Minister Ribbentrop. Ribbentrop arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning. The weather in Bordeaux was good, but it was reported to be very bad along the route to Tours, where I was to fly him. Cloud cover was between 100 and 150 feet. I told Ribbentrop that the bad weather, plus the fact that I did not know Tours airfield, meant that I could not fly him on my own responsibility. Ribbentrop was very upset on hearing this, and I learned that the meeting between Hitler and Franco had already taken place, and that Hitler was on his way to Tours to meet Marshal Pétain there. It was absolutely essential that Ribbentrop, as foreign minister, should be there too. In the circumstances, I agreed to do my best, on his responsibility. I took off all right, and for 2/3 of the way I flew blind. When we approached Tours, I got a beam from the station there, and the information that if I decided to land, it would have to be at my own risk. When I broke through the cloud, I found we had just skimmed a hangar. I landed safely. A bit of luck. Ribbentrop drove off at once to the country house where Marshal Pétain was staying, and I received instructions to fly to Belgium and wait there till further notice. After his meeting with Pétain, Hitler went on to Italy to meet Mussolini. When I got back to Berlin, I heard Hitler talking about his meetings with Franco and Pétain. The taking of Gibraltar would, of course, have been of enormous importance for Hitler, who had his soldiers in North Africa and desperately needed the command of the Mediterranean. Hitler had promised that if Franco would let him take Gibraltar, he would give it to Spain, and the Spaniards would then be rid of the British once and for all. But Hitler found Franco, as he said, a great disappointment. The Spanish statesman refused to have anything to do with the affair, and Hitler irritably declared that he had the manners of a sergeant major. On the other hand, Hitler always spoke of Marshal Pétain with sincere respect and assured us that he had always treated him with the greatest consideration, doing his utmost never to play the role of victor towards him. One evening I was in Vienna, strolling along the Kärntner Ring, when Flight Captain Sturr, Messerschmitt's chief test pilot, who was sitting outside a café, called out to me. I joined him, and he told me that he was on his way to Tokyo to demonstrate Messerschmitts to the Japanese. In conversation, he mentioned that Rudolf Hess frequently came to the Messerschmitt works in Augsburg to try out the new Me-2N, the very latest two-engined plane, a very swift job which had not yet become operational. Everyone knew that Hitler didn't like Hess flying and had forbidden him to fly alone. He always had to have a full flight captain with him. However, Hess went to Messerschmitt, who, of course, knew all about the prohibition, and declared that he had a special mission about which he was unable to talk. Now, for one thing, Hess was Deputy Führer, and for another, he might well have a special mission. So Messerschmitt let him have his way. But according to Sturr, everyone was worried to death when Hess flew the Me-210 on his own, because it needed a good deal of handling, and no one could be sure from the ground that Hess was experienced enough to fly it. Hess had a number of changes made in the plane. For example, he had the radar apparatus so installed that he could use it without assistance. Later on, I heard from Mortsiepen, his wireless operator, that Hess had begun to show a keen interest in instrument and beam flying. 4 weeks after that, I happened to meet Hess in Hitler's apartments, and he came straight up to me and declared bluntly, "Bauer, I want a map of the forbidden air zones." I had such a map for my own use, of course, but I dared not let it out of my hands, because I was sending planes here, there, and everywhere all the time, and before every flight I naturally had to make quite certain that they went nowhere near those zones, where they might be shot down by our own flak. Moreover, that map was clearly marked Reich Top Secret, which meant that I was not allowed to let anyone else know its contents. This secret map showed those zones over which even German planes were not allowed to fly, or only at certain definite heights, and as the details changed from time to time, you couldn't learn them off by heart once and for all. You had to have the up-to-the-minute supplements. I told Hess that he really needn't worry, because Captain Doldy would always be able to consult the map before any flight he undertook. But this, for reasons that were to become very clear to me later, didn't satisfy Hess. He wanted a map of his own. I told him that the only thing to do was to approach Milch, and this he asked me to do on his behalf. Milch was a bit nonplussed when I went to him and said that Hess wanted the secret map of the forbidden air zones, but after a moment or two's thought, he said, "Well, after all, he's the Deputy Führer, and I suppose there's such a thing as being overcautious. I'd better let him have it." And with that map, his training on the Me-210, and his industrious studying of instrument and blind flying, Hess was in a position to fly out of wartime Germany. 2 days after that, I flew Hitler to Munich. He went off to his Berghof Eyrie in the mountains, and I went out to Pilsensee to my wife and children. The weather was absolutely perfect, and I was looking forward to a day or two's fishing. But at 8 o'clock on the Sunday morning the telephone rang, and I was told that Hitler wanted to fly to Berlin as soon as possible. I knew that he had intended to spend the weekend quietly at Obersalzberg, and I wondered what on earth was the matter now. In any case, I got him off to Berlin that morning just as soon as ever I could, and at 1 o'clock I was in the Reich Chancellery for lunch. From the smoking room next to the restaurant you could see out into the garden, and there I noticed Hitler and Göring talking excitedly to each other, so I decided to go out into the garden and see if I could find out what was up. As I came closer, I heard Hitler say, "He must have gone mad, or he couldn't have done a thing like that to me. He stabbed me in the back. He wouldn't have done that if he'd been normal." At that moment, Hitler spotted me. "What do you think of it, Bauer?" I didn't know anything about it, and I had first to be told. It appeared that Hess had got into his Me-210, no doubt with his secret map and his newly acquired knowledge, and flown, it was supposed, to England. Göring then told me the details as far as they were known at the time. Hess's adjutant had been given a letter to put into Hitler's hands 5 hours after Hess took off from Augsburg on his flight, which meant that when we set off for Berlin from Munich, Hitler had already known what Hess had done, or had set out to do, because no one knew as yet whether he had succeeded. His flight had been plotted up to the neighbourhood of Amsterdam. As a matter of fact, our experts didn't give him much chance of getting to England. Constant patrols were flown over the North Sea precisely to deal with German planes flying to England, and there was a very good chance that Hess had been intercepted and shot down into the sea. Naturally, we now all listened with keen interest to the BBC broadcasts, because we assumed that if Hess did succeed, they would make a great propaganda campaign about it. But the BBC stayed mum. Clearly, at lunch that day, there was just one item of conversation: Hess and his action. One theory was that Hess wanted to prevent any further extension of the war. He held the opinion that the war between Britain and Germany was a disaster, and as he had important connections in England, he may have hoped to find influential people there to share his views and help him to put an end to the war. He probably also felt sure that if he succeeded in patching things up between Germany and Britain, Hitler would forgive him for his arbitrary action. Hess, as we heard later, was another man to suffer disappointment. At first, the British supposed that he had made his personal escape from the Third Reich, but when they discovered that he was still a fanatical Nazi, his undertaking looked merely like an attempt to sow discord in a country at war and suborn its nationals. It was, of course, quite impossible to keep the affair a secret in Germany, and a short official communiqué was issued, though it satisfied nobody. The cat was amongst the pigeons now, and there was tremendous excitement. But it didn't last for long. Still more important happenings gave people something else to think of. Shortly after German troops crossed the frontier into Russia, I flew Hitler to Rastenburg in East Prussia, and it was here that the Führer headquarters were situated for 3 years. 3 massive air raid shelters, or bunkers, were built, one each for Hitler, Goering and Bormann, who was now in Hess's place as deputy leader. Smaller bunkers were built for the headquarters personnel and for the guards. The place could have withstood massive bombing, but, in fact, it was never bombed at all, though on one occasion 3 Russian bombers were shot down within the outer perimeter. The whole installation was in the woods, and grass and plants were trained to grow on the roofs of all the bunkers and other buildings, so that the installation was practically invisible from the air, even if you knew that it was there. Rastenburg airfield was unsuitable for our big condors. Until extension work was carried out, we used Gerdauen airfield about 20 miles away, and in the meantime we used Ju-52s to maintain a shuttle service. At first, the German armies drove rapidly into Russia without meeting much resistance, and I was constantly flying Hitler forward for discussions with his generals in the field, or flying generals and marshals to him and back again for the regular situation discussions. The man I flew most often was undoubtedly Field Marshal von Kluge, but I also frequently flew von Manstein, Kleist and Küchler. Hitler invited Mussolini to come to Brest-Litovsk to watch a demonstration of Germany's latest 6.0 cm Fortress gun. I set off with them both in a Ju-52, together with various other people. I hadn't been in the air long before I realised that one of my engines was losing patrol, which was being blown back over the machine. Before long you could hardly see through the windscreen. I didn't know quite what to do, turn back or go on. Finally, as Brest-Litovsk was not far, I shut off the engine in question and flew on with the others. When we landed and I got out, I could see that my Ju-52 looked like a sardine which had just come out of its tin. The party, which included Mussolini's airman son, took a meal and then drove off to Brest-Litovsk proper. Hitler explained the effect of the new gun to Mussolini, who inspected the damage it had done. The loss of life amongst the garrison had been particularly heavy because the bombardment with such a powerful weapon had been totally unexpected. In the meantime, my mechanic, Zintel, had been investigating the cause of the trouble in our aircraft. It proved to be in the packing of an oil pump, By the time we got back, it had been made good, and the Jew 52 had been cleaned up. As Mussolini wished to visit Göring, we put him down on a small airfield near Spitzingsee, where Göring met him. After that, he went back to Italy, but he was soon with us again. A great victory was won near Uman, with hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners. As Italian troops had also taken part in the fighting, Mussolini decided to take the salute at a victory parade. He travelled in a special train to Grozny in Poland, and his train was halted near a tunnel into which it could be pulled as soon as there was an air raid warning. I flew with 3 Condors to Grozny to pick him up, and he was enthusiastic about the great 4-engine planes, which he had never seen before. He even asked Hitler's permission to let him fly our plane, and on a quiet stretch he was allowed to do so, with me sitting at his side. The weather was wonderful, and we flew from Grozny over Vinnitsa to Uman. It was a journey of over 600 miles, and we did it in 3.5 hours. When we touched down, the cars were waiting there to take Hitler and Mussolini to the victory parade. I did not go along, and so I did not witness Mussolini's great embarrassment when on their arrival the German troops were drawn up for inspection, with not an Italian in sight. There had been a good deal of rain, and their transport had stuck in the mud. Mussolini's show had to wait until they finally turned up. They returned to the airfield, and from there we all went on to a gravel pit, which was serving as one of the many collection centres for Russian prisoners. There were many thousands of them. Hitler had ordered that all Ukrainians should be set free to go home. Not unnaturally, there turned out to be an extraordinary number of Ukrainians amongst his prisoners. Many of them were lying, of course, and although some Russians may have succeeded in making their way back to their own army, most of them wandered around in our rear until they were picked up again by our men. On the way we came across hundreds of civilians trekking out to the gravel pit to fetch their soldier relatives back. Afterwards, Hitler was very interested to hear from me what Mussolini had thought about the Condor, and I told him that the Italian leader had been enthusiastic. Hitler then said that he would like to give Mussolini one, but he was a bit uncertain about his ability to manage it, as it was not so easy as the Ju-52. By this time it was autumn, and our troops were still steadily making their way into Russia. Here and there the Russians had tried to make a stand, but they had always been broken and forced to flood back still farther. But matters were not altogether perfect for us either. The Russians were not decisively beaten, and the enormous spaces were swallowing up our strength. As yet, however, success was still with us, and before long German tanks were on the outskirts of Moscow. Vast columns of Russian prisoners moved slowly westwards, and more came on behind them. Hitler was convinced that the war in Russia was already decided in his favour, and that it was only a question of time before the Russians formed a new government and offered to surrender. But then, after a wet autumn, the winter of 1941-42 set in. It proved to be the sort of winter that Russia experiences perhaps once in 100 years, and before long the whole front lay in the merciless grip of snow and ice, so that almost all movement came to a standstill. Our men suffered terribly, and their material and equipment proved unable to stand up to the extreme cold. Petrol turned to ice, batteries went dead, tanks, tractors, lorries and cars were immobilized. Guns were out of action because their breech blocks froze hard, and even smear oil turned into solid ice. But the worst trouble of all was undoubtedly the impossibility of keeping our supplies moving regularly. I can well remember Herr Ganzenmüller delivering his daily report to Hitler about how many trains had got through. It was reckoned that 65 had to go up daily in order to maintain supplies at a fairly satisfactory level, but very often Herr Ganzenmüller had to confess that only between 20 and 30 had got up. The others had been immobilized, invariably because of the intense cold. Perhaps the boiler had burst. Everything possible was done, but nevertheless our men huddled together at the front in a temperature of 90 degrees of frost, often without warm food in their bellies. A great campaign for the collection of winter clothing was now organised back home in Germany, but it was far too late, and some of it didn't arrive until the following Easter, by which time it was warmer anyway. A scapegoat had to be found, so Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief, was dismissed. Despite the intense cold, we made a number of flights deep into Russia, using the Heinkel 111. This plane could carry 6 passengers at a cruising speed of about 220 miles an hour, which was fast at the time. The Heinkel had one great disadvantage, though. It was very difficult to heat, and most of what heat there was escaped through the machine gun slots. On one flight to Mariupol on the Sea of Azov, I had Hitler, Major General Schmundt, his adjutant, and a doctor on board. We made an intermediate landing in Kiev, from where the local commander-in-chief was informed of Hitler's coming, and then we flew on. "Boah, it's shockingly cold in your plane," Hitler complained. "My feet are like lumps of ice." That wasn't surprising, because he just wasn't warmly enough dressed. I offered to get him a pair of fur-lined flying boots, but he refused on the ground that they weren't an issue for him. We landed in Mariupol. Hitler was met by Field Marshal Lieb and Sepp Dietrich, the commander of the so-called Leibstandarte, and they drove on at once to Taganrog, where there were difficulties. In the meantime, I insisted on getting him a pair of fur-lined flying boots, for which he had to sign a receipt. Later on, when I was in Mariupol, I saw that receipt framed and hanging up in the mess. When Hitler flew with important people, he insisted that several machines should carry them, so that in the event of a crash, the whole party should not be wiped out. When we flew back from Mariupol, therefore, Field Marshal von Reichenau, who was with him, flew in another machine. Our baggage machine, a slower plane, had already set off for Rastenburg, but the order now came to fly to Poltava instead. We tried to get into touch with the baggage machine, but the distance was too great, and so we arrived in Poltava without Hitler's effects, and also without von Reichenau. The pilot of von Reichenau's machine had lost his way, and he arrived only an hour and a half later. I tried to fix up Hitler for the night, but all he wanted was to borrow my safety razor and a blade in the morning. That night the discussions went on very late, but when we finally got to bed, there wasn't much rest. The patriotic Russian bedbugs saw to that. When I was in Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg, which was often, I always ate both lunch and dinner at the common table, and there were always lively discussions on the problems of the day. I recall an interesting discussion about lice. Hitler declared that he could well remember what a curse lice were from his First World War days, and jokingly he declared he would give the Knight's Cross on top of the War Service Cross to anyone who could invent something to save his men from this plague that was tormenting them. Himmler, who happened to be present, mentioned the well-known fact that cavalrymen rarely suffered from the attentions of lice. But as there were now fewer and fewer cavalrymen, there weren't many soldiers immune from the visitation. Professor Morel was also there, and, as it happened, he was an analytical chemist as well as a physician. He said that as it was obviously the sweat of the horses which kept the lice at bay, the thing to do was to manufacture the ingredients chemically and produce an anti-lice powder. It wasn't long after this that he reported that he had succeeded, using cheap waste products, and had produced a powder which experiments showed to be effective against lice. Production was now begun, but the disadvantage of this new powder was that it stank to high heaven, and many men said they much preferred the lice. Morel then tried to scent it, and he obtained large quantities of scent from Paris for the purpose, but he could never obtain enough, and so the stink remained. The epilogue. Professor Morel actually received the War Service Medal and the Knight's Cross as well, for the lice powder. Dr. Tott, the chief of the famous organisation Tott, which did Germany such tremendous services during the war, often came to Hitler to report, and we all liked him. He was not only a brilliant man, but also a very modest and likeable one. One evening after he had reported to Hitler, I was chatting with him. He told me that he must leave very early the following morning for Berlin, and that Dr. Speer would probably go with him. The next morning I drove to the airfield at about 08:30 as usual, and almost immediately I spotted a great cloud of smoke rising into the air. I knew what that was. When I came up, I discovered that it was a burning Heinkel, Dr. Tott's plane. The Heinkel had just taken on 750 gallons of petrol, so the fire would go on for quite a while. I had long rods brought up, and whilst the firemen clamped down the intense heat to allow us to work, we hooked the bodies out of the wreckage. The remains of a shoulder strap on one of the bodies showed clearly that it was Dr. Tot. Apart from him and the 3 men of the crew, there were 2 leave men in the plane, but Dr. Spear had decided, after all, not to go off so early. An investigation into the disaster was begun immediately. The weather was very bad, and there was a heavy storm at about 1,000 feet with a certain amount of snowfall. The exact time of the takeoff had been noted, of course. About 3 minutes later, the plane had returned with its undercarriage down. The pilot obviously intended to land, but observers were shocked to note that he was coming in to land with a powerful tailwind, which meant trouble because the runway just wasn't long enough. When the Heinkel was little more than 100 yards from the edge of the airfield and coming in fast, a stab of blue flame suddenly shot up from its rump. All observers were in agreement about this, so it could not have been from the petrol which was stored in wing tanks. The aircraft turned over at about 100 feet, crashed and burst into flames. Of course, the possibility of sabotage was taken into account at once, but no outsider could have got anywhere near the machine. Everyone who had had anything to do with the plane was tried and trusted, and Dr. Tot was very popular. A commission of inquiry was appointed by the Reich Air Ministry, and, amongst other measures, every piece of debris was carefully examined, at first without result. Dr. Tot's usual machine had been called in for a periodic overhaul and recheck, and in the meantime he had been given another machine, the one in which he had died. It was a Heinkel which had been used as a front-line machine, and like all operational machines, it had a built-in destructor device operated by a line with a ring at one end next to the pilot's seat. This device had a 3-minute fuse, and it enabled a pilot to let his crew get clear, set the fuse, and then escape himself before the plane blew up, to prevent its falling into the hands of the enemy. It was known that Dr. Tot always sat next to the pilot in the seat normally occupied by the wireless operator mechanic. Evidence showed that shortly before the start, Dr. Tot had walked through the small cabin to this seat. The gangway on this type of plane was very narrow, and Dr. Tot had been wearing a bulky combination suit. He squatted down and waited for the wireless operator mechanic to vacate the seat after the start. Thus he was in the gangway, and it was thought that probably the buckle on one of his flying boots had caught in the line of the destructor device shortly after the takeoff. The burning of the delayed action fuse would have been smelt, and any smell of burning in a plane is an urgent sign of danger, so no doubt the crew hastily tried to find out what the trouble was, whilst the pilot lowered his undercarriage and turned back. They probably discovered the trouble to their horror, and then the pilot must have known that he was racing against death, which accounted for his neglecting all normal safety precautions and coming in to land with a strong tailwind. He just had no time to circle and come in against the wind. The front still went steadily eastwards, and Rastenburg was soon 600 miles and more away from the fighting. That was much too far, so Hitler's headquarters had to be moved up. A suitable place was decided on in a small wood about 10 miles to the north of Vinnitsa in the Ukraine. The work progressed very swiftly. Apart from the usual surface huts, 2 bunkers were built, one for Hitler and his closer associates, and the other for headquarters personnel. They were considered primarily as air raid shelters, but in fact the Russians never bombed them, and the only air raid warnings we ever heard were on account of formations flying past to other objectives. The local civilian population was called upon to assist in certain tasks. Before long, our building supervisors noticed that the Ukrainians were very scared, and they couldn't understand why. In the end, after searching inquiries, it came out. A little while before, headquarters had been built in the neighbourhood for Marshal Timoshenko, and the local civilian population had been mobilised for this too. But at the end of it all, the men engaged on the job had just been deported, and their relatives had never heard of them again. The Ukrainians were afraid that the Germans would now do the same, and it wasn't easy to allay their fears. These headquarters were completed by the spring of 1942, and then Hitler moved in. The weather was good, there was a great deal of sunshine, and our relations with the local civilian population were excellent. So good, in fact, that the place was not even surrounded by barbed wire, and remained open on all sides until, much later on, partisans turned up in the neighbourhood of Berdichev, about 45 miles away. Only then did it become necessary to take special precautions. Our airfield was in Vinnytsia, and from there we flew to various points along the front: Stalino, Zaporozhye, Dnipropetrovsk, the Black Sea, Nikolaev, Mariupol, the Sea of Azov, etc. As Hitler had issued instructions that VIPs were not to travel by rail, we were kept very busy. In the wet weather we had a good deal of trouble, and those planes which, for some reason or other, we couldn't put away in the hangars, had to be propped up to prevent their wheels from sinking into the ground altogether. After a while we found a more favourable site a little distance away, and after that we used our old airfield merely for emergencies. It sticks in my mind in particular as the place where I first saw wolves outside a zoo. We were taxiing towards the start with Hitler on board when I spotted a couple of wolves at the edge of the airfield. They didn't seem much disturbed at our approach, and we got quite close to them before they finally looked at us and then loped off into the forest. My mechanic had drawn Hitler's attention to them, and we all saw them very clearly. There were other headquarters not far from us. Göring had put up his tent about 12 miles from Vinnytsia. Himmler was about 30 miles away, and Ribbentrop was somewhere in the Ukraine too. In my free time, oh yes, I had a few hours to myself occasionally, I would fish in the nearby bug, and my modern fishing tackle and my expert angling methods were always the centre of a good deal of admiring attention. Fortunately, I was also able to demonstrate to them that this marvellous tackle really worked, for I landed some very fine perch and pike. But the things that really made the Russians' eyes start out of their heads were our amphibious trucks. As a keen angler, it was impossible for me not to mention, in conversation with Hitler, the fun I got out of angling in my spare time. He wasn't so much opposed to angling, though he had little understanding for it, but he resolutely opposed all blood sports, and was prepared to approve the killing of animals only as a measure of game preservation, or to provide people with food. The only blood sportsman he had any respect for was the poacher. He at least, he said, pitted his wits against the gamekeeper as well as the prey, and risked a heavy fine or a term of imprisonment. So during the war, Hitler logically released almost all of them, declaring that poachers would make far better soldiers than Sunday afternoon sportsmen. A real battle between men and animals, in which the men took risks, appealed to him. He liked certain films sent to him by a friendly Maharaja, and he wasn't in the least disturbed at sequences showing men being torn to pieces by the animals they had set out to hunt. But when we saw films in which ordinary hunting took place, he would cover up his eyes and ask us to tell him when it was all over. Quite generally, his contemptuous remarks about blood sports and those who practiced them used to dismay our enthusiastic sportsmen. Altogether, Hitler's attitude towards dumb creatures, including birds, perturbed a good many of his devoted followers. Way back in 1933, Gauleiter Hafer of Innsbruck came to me and asked me to help him with a rare and unusual present, which he thought would please Hitler very much. It turned out that it was a live golden eagle, a bird which had become very rare, even in Tyrol. I told him that he wasn't likely to get much thanks from Hitler, and I recalled an incident which had happened earlier on. A wonderful pair of golden eagles had their eyrie on the rock face of the Hohe Girl above Obersalzberg. Hitler had always admired these birds as they soared high up over his own retreat. Then one day they were no longer to be seen. An enthusiastic sportsman had shot the male eagle, and to make matters worse, he had it stuffed and then presented it to Hitler. However, Hofer wasn't to be put off, so we carted the huge cage with its occupant, perhaps the most magnificent eagle I have ever seen, to the Reich Chancellery. Hitler looked at it with admiration, but then he said, "At least it's alive, Hofer, but it doesn't belong here. Bauer will fly you back with it to Innsbruck, take it to where it was captured, and then release it." Hofer then had to point out that one claw had been damaged when it was captured, whereupon the director of the Berlin Zoological Gardens was called to give his opinion. After examining the bird, he declared that it might no longer be able to capture its prey. Hitler then presented the powerful beast with its great eyes and its strong beak to the Berlin Zoo. Towards the end of the winter of 1941-42, I flew to Bucharest to fetch the Romanian Prime Minister, Antonescu, to Obersalzberg. It was very cold on Bucharest airfield when we started, though of course it was quite warm in our plane. But before long it rapidly got colder and colder, and it was quite clear that for some reason or other the heating apparatus had broken down. To make matters worse, the weather was bad, visibility was poor, and I had to fly very high, 13,000 feet and more, over the Carpathians, so that at one time we had 50 degrees of frost in the cabin. Antonescu, who was slim and delicately built, felt the cold very keenly. Fortunately, we had plenty of rugs, and we simply smothered him with them until all you could see of him was the tip of his nose. In the meantime, the cabin had become a refrigerator, and the windows were so frozen over that you couldn't see out. It took us 3.5 hours to get to Berchtesgaden, but at least I was able to promise Antonescu that it would be warmer on the way back, and it was, because the trouble, a burst pipe, was quickly repaired. In Bucharest, Antonescu invited me to dinner and presented me with the Romanian Order of the Crown. Despite the icy flight, and when we flew back, there were hampers of good things, food, tobacco, and wines and spirits, for us all. The son of Admiral Horthy, the Hungarian regent, was a pilot, and he was killed in a crash on the Eastern Front. From Ribbentrop we learned that young Horthy's mother was working as a nurse in a hospital in Berdichev, only about 45 miles away, so Hitler instructed Ribbentrop to go to her, express the deep regret of the German government, and invite her to visit him at his headquarters. Flew her in late that afternoon in the uniform of a Red Cross nurse. Hitler now expressed his sympathy in person and offered her a plane to take her back to Budapest for the funeral, which she accepted. So the next day I flew her to Budapest, together with Ambassador Hewell, who was to lay a wreath on the grave on Hitler's behalf. We remained in Budapest for 3 days, staying in the Gellert Hotel as guests of the Hungarian government. There were very few signs of war to be seen in the Hungarian capital, and one evening we were taken by officers of the Hungarian Air Force to a fashionable restaurant on Margaret Island in the Danube. Everything was as usual. There was no shortage of food, and we were almost the only guests in uniform. And as for ration cards, which Germany had introduced from the beginning of the war, they seemed unknown. A colonel of the Hungarian Air Force had been attached to us during our stay, and he asked me to tell Hitler that he and his friends would very much welcome more fighter planes so that they could play a more active part in the war. On my return to Vinnitsa, therefore, I passed this on to Hitler. No doubt they would like more fighter planes, he said grimly, but to fly around in, not to fight the Russians with. Petrol is scarce, and I've got none to spare for them. I want aggressive pilots, and what the Hungarians have done so far isn't much. No, if I've any fighter planes and petrol to spare, the Croats will get them. They're prepared to use them. Up to now, the Hungarians have been a fiasco. They were no good at the front, and when we withdrew them and set them to combating partisans in the rear, they were no good either. No, I'll keep my fighter planes. Hitler's judgments on his allies were often very severe, but there was one shining exception, and that was the Finns. He never mentioned them or their leader, Marshal Mannerheim, without paying them the highest tributes as soldiers. From the very beginning of the war, the German authorities were in touch with the protective powers in an effort to organize an exchange of prisoner-of-war mail with Soviet Russia. Many months passed, and still no answer came from the Soviet government. Then one day at table, Hitler told us that Stalin had at last replied, saying, "There are no Russian prisoners in German hands. The Russian soldier fights to the death. Should he ever allow himself to be taken prisoner, he would thereby automatically exclude himself from the community of Russian people." The Russian government has therefore no interest in any exchange of prisoner of war mail with Germany. Germany, of course, already held vast numbers of Russian prisoners of war, including Stalin's own son. One morning it was reported to me that one of my officers, Flight Captain Schneebler, had been seriously wounded the night before. I went to see him at once. He was stationed near Berdichev, and the previous evening he had visited a folk German Sikhs village. It was dark by the time he wanted to go back to his quarters, so for fear of losing the way he asked his host to provide him with a guide. The peasant's 2 daughters went off with Schneebler in the car. A mile or so from the village there was a bridge, and when they got there they found it blocked by a tree trunk. Schneebler and his driver got out to move the obstacle to one side, but shots rang out. The driver and one of the 2 girls were killed instantly, and Schneebler was seriously wounded. The other girl jumped out of the car and managed to make her escape. When help came, the 2 corpses and the wounded man were naked. The partisans had stripped them of every stitch of clothing, and the car had been set on fire. Unfortunately, Schneebler died of his wounds next day. Later on, Himmler told me that they had caught the leader of the partisans. Schneebler's papers had been found on him. Hitler was in the Ukraine throughout the summer of 1942, and I suppose in that period I flew Field Marshal Hans von Kluge at least a dozen times backwards and forwards between Vinitsa and Smolensk. "Go and fetch me clever Hans from Smolensk," Hitler would say. The Sixth Army had pushed forward as far as Stalingrad. German troops were in the Caucasus, and a mountain unit had climbed Mount Elbrus and hoisted the German flag on its summit. "We'll be in Tiflis soon, Bauer," said General Jodl one day, "and then you're to fly me there for discussions with our commanding generals." But it didn't come off. Disaster gathered over Stalingrad, and we withdrew to our old headquarters at the so-called Wolf's Lair, or Wolfschanze, in Rastenburg. Every time I flew back now, I would take wounded men with me in our big 4-engined Condors. They were usually severe cases, with a chance of survival only if they could be got back to Germany quickly. When we flew in, we would bring blankets and medical supplies, which were often in short supply at the front.